There were soul singers in the 1960s that every American with a radio knew by heart. They came out of every jukebox, every corner bar, every transistor radio on every front porch in summer. They sold millions of records. They filled theaters from Harlem to Memphis. But when soul music decided who its legends would be, most of them got left in the back pages. These 25 soul singers every American knew before the world moved on. Subscribe before we start so you don't miss any of our lookbacks. Number 25, Sam and Dave. For a few years in the middle of the 1960s, nobody on a stage could touch them. Sam Moore and Dave Prater came up out of the gospel church, and they brought the church with them. Two voices trading lines and finishing each other's phrases at a pitch of pure excitement that left audiences wrung out. Soul Man and Hold On, I'm Comin' were not just hits. They were the sound of Stax Records at its absolute peak, cut with Isaac Hayes and David Porter writing and Booker T and the MGs playing behind them. They were so electric on stage that other acts flatly refused to follow them. Otis Redding was one of the few who would, and yet the two men barely spoke to each other for years, riding in separate cars, meeting only at the microphone. When the hits dried up, the act that had burned hotter than almost anyone slowly slipped from memory, until most people today can sing every word of Soul Man without having the faintest idea who sang it. Number 24, Arthur Alexander. Here's a claim that sounds impossible until you check it. Arthur Alexander is the only songwriter, alive or dead, whose songs were recorded by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan. The Beatles cut his song Anna. The Stones put You Better Move On their very first record. Dylan recorded Sally Sue Brown. Paul McCartney said it plainly. If the Beatles wanted a sound, that sound was Arthur Alexander. He was a country soul pioneer from Alabama, and his records helped put the legendary Muscle Shoals studio on the map. But the money never came. The men who covered him became the biggest acts on earth, and Arthur Alexander gave up on the business and drove a bus for a living for more than 20 years. He finally came back in 1993 with a new album and a new contract, the comeback he had waited his whole life for. Then, 3 days after a show in Nashville, his heart gave out. He was 53 and almost nobody knew his name. Number 23, Percy Sledge. In 1966, a hospital orderly from Alabama walked into a studio and recorded one of the most enduring songs in American history. When a Man Loves a Woman went to number 1 on both the pop and the rhythm and blues charts, the first record from the Muscle Shoals sound to top the pop chart in America. That organ, that slow build, that ache in his voice. It has never really left the radio in almost 60 years. But here is what happened to Percy Sledge. He signed away his rights to the song. He never received a songwriter's credit for the melody his bandmates helped him build, and for decades the biggest ballad of his life earned him almost nothing. He kept performing it night after night in small venues for the rest of his life. The song became immortal. The man who sang it worked the oldies circuit in near anonymity, remembered as a voice on a record rather than a person. Number 22, Z.Z. Hill. Z.Z. Hill spent 20 years as one of the great almost men of soul music, a singer good enough to make a living and never quite big enough to break through. He recorded for label after label through the 60s and 70s, always respected, never a star. And then, at the start of the 1980s, when almost everyone had written off traditional soul as a dead form, he made the record that changed everything. His album, Down Home, and its single, Down Home Blues, became one of the best-selling blues records of an entire generation. It stayed on the charts for nearly 2 years. It single-handedly proved there was still a huge black audience hungry for real, grown-up Southern soul, and it launched the whole modern Southern soul industry that followed. Z.Z. Hill finally became the star he had chased for 2 decades, and then, in 1984, barely 3 years into it, he died of a blood clot. He was 48. Number 21, Joe Tex. Before there was a clear line between soul singing and rap, there was Joe Tex, half preaching and half singing, talking his way through story songs with a wink and a wagging finger. Hold What You've Got and Skinny Legs and All made him a star, and his funny, sermon-like delivery was completely his own. He had one of the longest-running feuds in music history with James Brown, the two of them trading insults and, by some accounts, gunfire for years. Joe Tex had been there at the very start, recording for years before the hits came, watching younger men take the sound he helped shape and run past him with it. He converted to Islam, walked away from music at the height of his fame, came back, scored one last giant hit with Ain't Gonna Bump No More, and walked away again. When he died of a heart attack at 47, one of the true founding voices of soul was already becoming a footnote in the story he helped begin. Number 20, Baby Washington. Smokey Robinson once called her his favorite singer. Dusty Springfield said the same. Baby Washington was a singer's singer, a woman whose phrasing and control were studied by the very people who went on to become far more famous than she ever did. Through the late 50s and the 60s, she put out a long run of gorgeous, aching records. That's how heartaches are made, chief among them. She was one of the singers who built the template for the soul ballad, the sound that Dionne Warwick and a dozen others would ride to superstardom. But Baby Washington recorded for small labels, never got the promotion machine behind her, and watched from the edges as her style became the sound of the decade. The singers who idolized her became household names. She became a name that only the deepest soul collectors could place, a foundational voice hiding in plain sight. Number 19, Brook Benton. Brook Benton had a warm, deep, honeyed baritone that could slide from gospel to pop to country without ever losing its grain, and for a stretch around 1960, he was one of the biggest black singers in America. It's just a matter of time, and his duets with Dinah Washington were everywhere. He was a genuine crossover star at a moment when that was still rare and hard, and he wrote songs for other artists on top of it. Then the British invasion and the harder Motown and Stax sounds arrived, and the smooth balladeers like Benton suddenly sounded old-fashioned. His career went cold for years, and then, in 1970, out of nowhere, he cut a rainy, atmospheric masterpiece called Rainy Night in Georgia that went top 5 all over again and reminded everyone what they had lost. It was a last great flash. When he died in 1988, the smoothest voice of his era had already slipped most of the way out of memory. Number 18, Chuck Jackson. Chuck Jackson had the kind of big, dramatic, full-throated baritone that made a song sound like an event, and in the early 1960s he was one of the most reliable hitmakers in rhythm and blues. I Don't Want to Cry and Any Day Now were towering records, and that second one has been covered by everyone from Elvis Presley to Ronnie Milsap, who took it to number 1 on the country chart 2 decades later. He was one of the first stars signed to Scepter Records, and he helped build that label into a powerhouse. But when he left it to chase bigger money at Motown, the hits stopped almost overnight, and one of the great voices of the era faded fast. Any Day Now is still sung today. Chuck Jackson, the man who first made it soar, spent his later decades as a beloved figure on the beach music circuit, known to the faithful and forgotten by nearly everyone else. Number 17, Garnet Mimms. If you have heard Janis Joplin wail her way through Cry Baby, then you have heard a Garnet Mimms song, because he recorded it first in 1963 and took it to the top of the rhythm and blues chart. His voice came straight out of the black gospel tradition, a raw, testifying, church-wrecking instrument, and singers took notes. Van Morrison has called him one of the greatest soul singers who ever lived. Mimms and his group, the Enchanters, had a run of powerful records in the mid-60s, and his gospel-drenched style helped lay the groundwork for the deep soul that followed. But he never crossed over into the mainstream fame his voice deserved, and by the 1970s he had walked away from secular music entirely to return to the church and preach. He simply chose to disappear. The songs he originated became famous in other people's mouths, while the man who first sang them slipped quietly out of the world he helped create. Number 16, Solomon Burke. They called him the king of rock and soul, and he wore an actual crown and robe on stage to prove it. Solomon Burke was one of the foundational architects of soul music itself, the man whose early 60s records for Atlantic, Cry to Me, Just Out of Reach, Everybody Needs Somebody to Love essentially taught the label how to make soul records. The Rolling Stones covered him. Everybody borrowed from him. He was also one of the most extraordinary characters music has ever produced. He was an ordained bishop with his own church. He ran a chain of mortuaries. He fathered 21 children and built a family choir out of his own descendants. He sold sandwiches and popcorn to the audiences at his own concerts. And yet, for all of it, the general public let his name slip away while the men he taught became legends. If a voice on this list has stirred a memory, subscribe now and stay with me. The biggest names are still ahead. Number 15, Little Willie John. He stood 5'4" and he sang like a giant. In 1956, a teenager named Little Willie John first recorded a song called Fever, a slow, smoldering, finger-snapping masterpiece that went to number 1 on the rhythm and blues chart and sold over 1 million copies. 2 years later, Peggy Lee covered it, rewrote some of the words, and made it a standard, and it is her version that the world remembers. Almost nobody remembers his. Little Willie John was one of the most gifted singers of the entire decade, with a string of hits and an influence on soul that ran straight through James Brown and Stevie Wonder, who took the name Little Stevie in tribute to him. But his life came apart. He was convicted of manslaughter after a stabbing, and in 1968 he died in a Washington state prison cell, 2 months before he was eligible for parole. He was 30 years old. James Brown recorded an entire album in his memory that same year. Number 14, Barbara Lynn. In an era when a black woman fronting a band and playing her own electric guitar was almost unheard of, Barbara Lynn did exactly that, left-handed, out of Beaumont, Texas. In 1962, she wrote and sang You'll Lose a Good Thing, and it went straight to number 1 on the rhythm and blues chart and into the pop top 10. She wrote her own material at a time when almost no women in the business were allowed to. The Rolling Stones thought enough of her to record one of her songs. She toured the world and held her own with anyone, but the industry never quite knew what to do with a woman who wrote, sang, and played lead guitar. And as the 60s wore on, she stepped back to raise a family in Texas, one of the most quietly groundbreaking artists of her generation, a genuine pioneer for every woman who later picked up a guitar, became a name that even serious music fans struggle to place. Number 13, Jerry Butler. They called him the Iceman for the cool, smooth, unhurried dignity of his voice, and he began at the very top. As the original lead singer of the Impressions, alongside a young Curtis Mayfield, he sang the group's first big hit, For Your Precious Love, in 1958. It is considered by many to be one of the first true soul records ever made. Then, remarkably, he left the group just as it was taking off to go out on his own. The solo career was long and rich. He Will Break Your Heart and Only the Strong Survive were major hits, and his partnership with Gamble and Huff helped invent the lush Philadelphia soul sound of the 70s. And then Jerry Butler did something almost no soul star has ever done. He got into politics, and he served for decades as an elected county official in Chicago, quietly and seriously, long after the public forgot he had once been one of the smoothest voices in America. Number 12, Tommy Hunt. Tommy Hunt had one of those voices that other singers envied, a soaring, dramatic tenor that could fill a room. He started in the doo-wop era with a group called the Flamingos, singing behind the lead on one of the most beautiful records ever made, I Only Have Eyes for You, that dreamy, echoing ballad that still turns up in films to this day. Then he went solo and recorded an early version of a Burt Bacharach and Hal David song called I Just Don't Know What to Do With Myself. Dusty Springfield would later make that song a standard, and the White Stripes would revive it again decades after that. But Tommy Hunt sang it years before either, and almost nobody knows it. His American career faded, and here's the strange twist. He moved to England, where the underground northern soul scene had quietly turned him into a legend, and he became a bigger star across the ocean than he had ever been at home. An American voice, forgotten in America, kept alive by dancers in the north of England. Number 11, James Carr. Some people who know soul music deeply will tell you that the greatest deep soul record ever made is a song called The Dark End of the Street, a guilt-soaked ballad about a doomed affair, and that the man who sang it best was James Carr. His voice had a haunted, bottomless quality that could make the hair stand up on your arms. For a few years in the late 1960s out of Memphis, he made a run of records as powerful as anything the genre produced, but James Carr was fighting a battle no one at the time understood. He suffered from severe bipolar disorder in an era with little treatment and no language for it. He would freeze on stage, unable to move or sing. His career collapsed under the weight of an illness people mistook for unreliability. The most gifted deep soul singer of his generation spent decades in and out of care, and the world that should have crowned him simply moved on without him. Number 10, Maxine Brown. Maxine Brown had a gorgeous, gospel-trained voice, and in the early 60s she made some of the most exquisite soul ballads of the era. Oh No, Not My Baby is a small masterpiece, a song so good that Rod Stewart and Manfred Mann and others lined up to cover it for years afterward. She recorded for Scepter Records alongside Dionne Warwick and the Shirelles, right at the beating heart of early 60s soul, and that turned out to be the problem. At her own label, the promotion, the best songs, and the spotlight went to Dionne Warwick, and Maxine Brown spent her career one seat away from stardom, watching the machine push somebody else. She sang duets with Chuck Jackson, whom you met earlier on this list, and toured relentlessly, but she never got the single that would have made her a household name. A voice that belonged in the very top rank became a favorite of collectors and a stranger to everyone else. Number 9, Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack was soul royalty who somehow never quite got treated like it. He started as a teenager in a family gospel group discovered by Sam Cooke himself. He wrote It's All Over Now, and the Rolling Stones took it and scored their first ever number 1 in Britain with it. He played guitar behind everyone, wrote songs for everyone, and had a voice as rough and real as any in the business. But scandal shadowed him early. Not long after Sam Cooke died, Womack married Cooke's widow, and much of the music world turned on him for it. It took years to climb back. He finally became a star in his own right in the 70s with records like Across 110th Street, and he kept making great music for decades. Yet for a man that important, that connected to Sam Cooke, to the Stones, to the whole story of soul, Bobby Womack remains oddly unsung, a giant that the casual listener has mostly never heard of. Number 8, Esther Phillips. She was a child prodigy so gifted that she was winning talent contests and cutting rhythm and blues hits at the age of 14, billed as Little Esther. Her voice had a sharp, nasal, utterly distinctive edge that you could pick out of any crowd. In the early 1950s, she was one of the biggest young stars in black music. Then addiction took hold, and she vanished from the business for most of a decade. What makes Esther Phillips remarkable is that she came back more than once. She returned in the 60s with a stunning country soul version of Release Me, and again in the 70s with a searing autobiographical record about addiction called Home is Where the Hatred Is, written by Gil Scott-Heron. When she lost the Grammy for Best Female Rhythm and Blues Performance one year, the woman who beat her, Aretha Franklin, gave Esther the award, saying she deserved it more. Even Aretha knew, and still the wider world forgot her. Number 7, Bobby Blue Bland. If B.B. King was the king of the blues guitar, Bobby Bland was the king of the blues voice, and the two were friends from their earliest days in Memphis. Bland never played an instrument on stage. He did not have to. He had that unmistakable squall, a strangled, gospel-derived cry he could drop into the middle of a line that audiences would wait all night to hear. Turn on Your Love. Light and I Pity the Fool were staples of every jukebox in black America. For decades, Bobby Bland was one of the most consistent and beloved figures in rhythm and blues, a headliner who sold records steadily year after year without ever chasing a trend. But he crossed over to the white mainstream far less than his talent deserved, and outside the world of blues and soul devotees, his name faded. One of the greatest voices America ever produced, a genuine peer of B.B. King, is remembered today by a fraction of the people who should know him. Number 6. William Bell. William Bell was there at the very beginning of Stax Records, and he helped define its sound. In 1961, he recorded You Don't Miss Your Water, one of the first true Southern soul ballads, a song so foundational that it became a template others built careers on. He was a gifted writer as much as a singer, and he co-wrote the blues standard Born Under a Bad Sign for Albert King, a song later covered by Cream and Jimi Hendrix. While the label's flashier stars became famous, Bell was the quiet craftsman in the background, writing and singing and holding the sound together. He finally had a big solo hit in 1976 with Tryin' to Love Too. And then, decades later, in a rare happy turn for this list, he came all the way back, winning a Grammy in 2017 for an album of new material. But for most of his life, the man who helped write the rulebook for Southern Soul remained almost invisible outside of it. Number 5. O.V. Wright. O.V. Wright had one of the most intense, wounded, deeply spiritual voices in all of soul music, a sound that came straight out of the gospel quartets he sang in as a young man. When he crossed over to secular music, he brought all of that fervor with him. Records like Ace of Spades and A Nickel and a Nail are treasured by soul obsessives as some of the rawest, most emotionally naked recordings the genre ever produced. But O.V. Wright's life was hard, and it was short. Drug problems and legal trouble dogged him throughout his career, and his health broke down early. He died in 1980 at the age of 41, having never come close to the recognition his gift deserved. Among singers and serious fans, his name is spoken with something like reverence. Among everyone else, it is not spoken at all. He may be the single most criminally forgotten voice on this entire list. Number 4. Bettye LaVette. Here is a story that finally breaks the pattern. Bettye LaVette cut her first hit as a teenager in 1962 and then spent more than 40 years as one of the great lost talents of soul music. She made brilliant records that labels shelved or barely released. An entire album she recorded for Atlantic in 1972 was inexplicably locked in a vault and not released for 33 years. She sang in obscurity, in small clubs, watching decade after decade pass her by. And then, in her late 50s and early 60s, the world finally caught up to Bettye LaVette. A new label, a series of stunning albums of reinterpreted songs, and suddenly she was earning Grammy nominations, singing at the Kennedy Center for the Who, and performing at a presidential inauguration. She became, impossibly, a star in her 60s and 70s, after a lifetime of being overlooked. Most people on this list never got their due. Bettye LaVette had to wait almost her whole life, but she got hers. Number 3, Mary Wells. She was the queen of Motown before Diana Ross, the first true superstar the label ever produced. A teenager from Detroit, Mary Wells walked up to Berry Gordy with a song she had written for Jackie Wilson, and Gordy signed her on the spot. With Smokey Robinson writing for her, she delivered a string of classics, and in 1964, her recording of My Guy became the first #1 pop hit in Motown's history. She was, at that moment, the biggest star the company had, and that is when it all went wrong. Convinced she was being underpaid on a contract she had signed at 17, Mary Wells left Motown at the absolute peak of her fame. The magic did not follow her. Label after label, the hits never came again, and one of the most important voices in the story of Motown spent the rest of her career trying to recapture a moment that had already passed. She died of cancer in 1992, at just 49, largely forgotten by a public that once knew every word she sang. Number 2, Clyde McPhatter. Before soul music had a name, Clyde McPhatter was inventing its blueprint. His high, aching, gospel-drenched tenor was the most imitated voice in rhythm and blues in the 1950s. He was the voice that made Billy Ward and his Dominoes famous, and then he walked away and founded a group of his own called the Drifters, one of the most important vocal groups in American history. Then he left them too and became a solo star. He was the first artist ever inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice. Elvis Presley studied him. Smokey Robinson idolized him. Every soul singer who came after owed him something. And yet Clyde McPhatter died in 1972 at just 39 years old, broke and despondent over a career that, in one writer's words, made him a legend, but hardly a success. The man who arguably invented the sound of soul singing could not afford, in his own bitter words, a bottle of Coca-Cola in the neighborhood where everyone had once heard his records. Number 1, Jackie Wilson. They called him Mr. Excitement, and no one who saw him ever forgot it. Jackie Wilson could sing anything, spin, drop to his knees, hit a high note that seemed to come from another world, and then do a backflip while he did it. He got his start replacing Clyde McPhatter, the man you just heard about, in Billy Ward's Dominoes, and then he went solo and became one of the most electrifying performers America has ever produced. Lonely Teardrops, Higher and Higher, Baby Workout, 16 top 10 rhythm and blues hits, and a voice that could do absolutely anything. He was a direct influence on Elvis Presley, on James Brown, on Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson said so himself. And here is how the story ends. In 1975, on stage in New Jersey, in the middle of singing Lonely Teardrops, Jackie Wilson suffered a massive heart attack and collapsed. The crowd thought it was part of the act. He fell into a coma and never really recovered, lingering for years before he died in 1984. He was buried in an unmarked grave because there was no money for a headstone until fans raised the funds themselves. The stone they finally gave him reads, "No more lonely teardrops." That is where this list has to end, because Jackie Wilson is the whole story in one man. The biggest talent, the wildest stage show, the voice that shaped the 3 most famous entertainers of the century, and an unmarked grave. Every singer we have named tonight was somebody's favorite once. They came out of every radio in America, and then America moved on, and the names slipped away one by one. If we brought even one of them back to you tonight, then they are not quite forgotten after all. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe, and watch the next video above.